The salt-stained stone walls of Trinity College's old library seemed to whisper ancient secrets as Dr. Alastair Langley carefully extracted the DNA sample from its protective case. Outside, Dublin's rain tapped against leaded glass windows, a rhythm as old as Ireland itself. He paused, holding the small vial up to the light, where it gleamed like liquid amber. "This," he said to the small group of fellow geneticists gathered around him, "might finally explain why some Irish families carry genetic markers unlike any others in Western Europe." The sample contained what locals had whispered about for centuries, what tourists photographed with curious smiles, what generations of scientists had dismissed as folklore. The genetic signature of the so-called Black Irish. Those Irish with distinctively dark features in a land famous for red hair and fair skin. Their genetic origins had remained one of the most persistent mysteries in population genetics, spawning theories from Spanish Armada survivors to ancient Mediterranean traders. But the truth, as Dr. Langley was about to discover, was far stranger than any of these theories. It would challenge not just our understanding of Irish history, but the very narrative of human migration throughout Europe. "What we're about to see," he said, sliding the sample into the sequencer, "isn't just the story of a people. It's the story of what happens when historical record and genetic evidence collide. No one in that room could have predicted how deep that collision would go, or how it would eventually unveil a 15,000-year-old secret that had been hiding in plain sight." The term Black Irish emerged from the shadows of colonial history, initially as a casual descriptor for Irish people with darker features, black hair, dark eyes, olive skin, standing in contrast to the stereotypical Celtic appearance of fair skin, blue eyes, and red or blonde hair. For centuries, this phenotypic variation was explained away through convenient historical narratives. Survivors from the Spanish Armada washing ashore in Ireland in 1588, Norman invaders bringing Mediterranean genes, or even Phoenician traders establishing outposts on Irish shores thousands of years ago. Dr. Hannah Jones, a paleogeneticist from Oxford University, had spent 2 decades studying ancient DNA from archaeological sites across the British Isles. "The problem with all these popular theories," she explained during a 2018 lecture at Cambridge, "is that they're based on coincidence and folklore rather than genetic evidence. If Spanish sailors had made a significant genetic contribution to the Irish population, we would see clear markers of Iberian ancestry clustering in coastal regions. We simply don't." The quest to solve this mystery began in earnest in 2010, when the Irish Genome Project launched with the ambitious goal of sequencing DNA from over 10,000 individuals across the island, focusing particularly on families with deep roots in specific regions. Dr. Langley joined the project in its second year, focusing specifically on mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child, which allows scientists to trace maternal lineages back through thousands of years. "I was initially looking for something else entirely," Langley admitted during our interview in his cramped office at Trinity College. Maps of Ireland covered his walls, each pinned with colored markers indicating sampling locations. "We were investigating possible Norse genetic influence from Viking settlements." The Black Irish pattern emerged completely by accident. The accident occurred when one of Langley's graduate students, Marcus O'Connor, noticed something unusual in samples from specific regions of Western Ireland, particularly counties Kerry, Cork, and Galway. These samples contained a mitochondrial haplogroup, a genetic lineage identified by specific mutations that didn't match expected patterns for Northern European populations. "Initially, we thought it was contamination," O'Connor recalled. "The markers resembled haplogroup U5b1, which is found throughout Europe, but with distinctive mutations we hadn't documented before. When we ran the tests again with fresh samples, the results were identical. Whatever we were seeing was real." What made this discovery particularly intriguing was the geographic distribution. The unusual genetic markers were concentrated along Ireland's western coast, precisely the regions associated with the traditional Black Irish phenotype, but with no corresponding pattern in other European populations, including Spain. By 2015, Langley's team had identified what they temporarily designated as haplogroup U5b1 Irish variant, present in approximately 8% of the Western Irish population. The next step was to determine its age and origin, which required ancient DNA samples for comparison. This is where Dr. Hannah Jones entered the picture. Her work with ancient remains throughout Britain and Ireland offered the historical depth needed to contextualize Langley's findings. The collaborative project that emerged would eventually rewrite the story of prehistoric migration in Western Europe. We needed to understand if this was a recent introduction to Ireland's genetic landscape, within the last 2,000 years or so, or something much older, Jones explained. The only way to determine that was to find the same genetic signature in ancient remains and date it. The search began with preserved human remains from archaeological sites across Ireland, focusing on those dating from the Neolithic period, 4000 to 2500 BCE, through the Bronze Age and into medieval times. Initial results were disappointing. The distinctive genetic pattern appeared sporadically but offered no clear pattern of introduction. Then came the breakthrough that would transform the investigation entirely. In 2017, a construction project for a new highway near Galway unearthed a previously unknown burial site. Carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 5,000 years old, corresponding to Ireland's Neolithic period. When Jones analyzed DNA from these remains, she found something unexpected. The U5B1 variant was present, but at a much higher frequency, nearly 40% of the samples. This told us two important things, Jones said. First, this genetic signature wasn't introduced by medieval Spanish sailors or Norman invaders. It was already present in Ireland thousands of years earlier. Second, its frequency had declined over time, suggesting it was once more common in the population. But the real mystery was just beginning. If this genetic signature predated historical migrations to Ireland, where did it come from? And why did it create the physical characteristics associated with the Black Irish? The answers would lead researchers through 15,000 years of human migration, Ice Age refuges, ancient cave paintings, and ultimately to a lost chapter of European prehistory that had been literally buried beneath the waves. To understand the true origins of the Black Irish genetic signature, we must first travel back to the last ice age, a time when massive glaciers covered much of northern Europe, making large swaths of the continent uninhabitable for early humans. As the ice sheets advanced around 20,000 years ago, human populations retreated to southern refuges in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. These ice age refuges created genetic bottlenecks, explained Dr. Arthur Lawson, a paleoclimatologist at University College London who specializes in human adaptation to climate change. Small populations became isolated for thousands of years, developing distinct genetic signatures. When the ice began retreating around 15,000 years ago, these populations expanded northward again, bringing their genetic distinctiveness with them. The prevailing model of post-glacial recolonization suggested that most of Western Europe, including the British Isles, was primarily repopulated from the Iberian refuge. This aligned neatly with archaeological evidence showing cultural connections between Mesolithic sites in Ireland and similar sites in northern Spain and Portugal. However, the genetic pattern identified in Western Ireland didn't match expected markers from the Iberian refuge population. Instead, it seemed to represent a completely different source population, one that hadn't been previously documented in the archaeological record of Western Europe. "We were dealing with a ghost population," Langley said, using the term geneticists apply to ancient groups known only through their genetic signatures rather than direct archaeological evidence. Their DNA was there, but we couldn't identify where they came from or how they reached Ireland. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: ancient DNA samples from Doggerland, a now-submerged landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe. During the last ice age, sea levels were significantly lower, exposing a vast plain that stretched from Britain's east coast to the Netherlands. As the ice melted, this region slowly flooded, becoming completely submerged by around 6,500 BCE. In 2016, a Dutch fishing vessel dredged up human remains from the North Sea floor. These remains, carbon dated to approximately 9,000 years old, came from what would have been the last remnants of Doggerland before it was fully submerged. When geneticists sequenced DNA from these remains, they found the same distinctive U5B1 variant present in Western Ireland. "This was our missing puzzle piece," Hannah Jones explained. The genetic signature we were seeing in the so-called Black Irish wasn't Spanish or Mediterranean at all. It came from this lost Mesolithic population that had once inhabited Doggerland. Further evidence emerged as researchers reanalyzed previously collected ancient DNA samples from across northwestern Europe with this new perspective. They discovered the same genetic markers in Mesolithic remains from coastal Scotland, particularly the Hebrides, and in smaller frequencies along Norway's western coastline. A new narrative began to take shape. As Doggerland gradually flooded, its inhabitants moved to higher ground, following the coastlines of what would become Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. These people were maritime specialists, with technologies adapted for coastal living and seafaring, skills that allowed them to navigate the increasingly fragmented landscape of melting ice and rising seas. "We believe they were following marine resources," said Dr. Elena Marquez, an archaeologist specializing in prehistoric coastal adaptations. Seals, certain fish species, and other marine mammals would have been crucial to their diet. As Doggerland submerged, these resources, and the people who depended on them, moved along the newly forming coastlines. This migration pattern explained why the genetic signature was concentrated along Ireland's western coast. These Doggerland refugees weren't random wanderers but specialists following specific ecological niches. When they reached Ireland, they settled in areas that matched their maritime adaptation, the rocky, resource-rich western coastline. But a significant question remained: what did these Doggerland people look like? And was their appearance the source of the distinctive Black Irish phenotype? Here, the research took another unexpected turn. Jones collaborated with Dr. Maxwell Chun, a specialist in phenotype reconstruction from genetic material at the University of California, Berkeley. Using genetic markers associated with physical appearance, Chun created a probable phenotype model for the Doggerland population. The results were striking, Chun said. Based on the genetic markers, this population likely had darker hair and eyes than the later arriving Neolithic farmers from continental Europe. They weren't Mediterranean in appearance, but they did carry specific alleles associated with increased melanin production compared to other northern European populations. This physical reconstruction aligned perfectly with the traditional description of the Black Irish, not as dark as Mediterranean populations, but distinctly darker than the Celtic stereotype. The mystery was beginning to unravel. The Black Irish weren't descendants of Spanish sailors or Norman invaders. They were the modern remnants of Europe's lost Mesolithic maritime culture, the people of Doggerland. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As researchers compared the Doggerland genetic signature with global DNA databases, they discovered something that would rewrite the narrative of European prehistory entirely. Genetic connections to populations thousands of miles from Ireland, in places no one had expected. In the fluorescent-lit basement laboratory of Trinity College, Dr. Alastair Langley stared at the computer screen displaying comparison results from the global ancient DNA database. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system preserving thousands of DNA samples in their temperature-regulated storage units. "This can't be right," he murmured, running the analysis again. "We need to check for contamination." What had startled him was a pattern of genetic similarities between the Doggerland/Black Irish haplogroup and ancient DNA samples from a completely unexpected source: archaeological sites in North America, specifically from the northeastern coastline dating to approximately 9,000 to 7,000 years ago. The implications were potentially revolutionary and highly controversial. Was there a genetic connection between Mesolithic maritime populations in Europe and ancient indigenous populations in North America? If confirmed, this would challenge the prevailing understanding of prehistoric human migration and contact between continents. "We proceeded with extreme caution," Hannah Jones recalled. "Claims of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas have a problematic history, often associated with fringe theories and even racist attempts to undermine indigenous heritage. We needed to be absolutely certain of our findings before making any public statements." The research team implemented rigorous validation protocols, sending identical samples to 3 independent laboratories specializing in ancient DNA analysis. They also consulted with indigenous genetic researchers and archaeologists from affected regions in North America to ensure ethical research practices. After months of verification, the results remained consistent. There were indeed specific genetic markers shared between the Doggerland population and certain ancient coastal sites in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Maine. However, the pattern of sharing suggested something more complex than direct migration. What we're seeing isn't evidence of prehistoric Europeans discovering America, explained Dr. Winona Reed, an indigenous geneticist from Dalhousie University who joined the research team. Rather, it suggests brief contact between maritime-adapted populations from both continents, possibly resulting in limited genetic exchange. The timing aligned with a critical period in Earth's climate history. Around 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a dramatic cold period known as the 8.2 kilo-year event, likely caused by the final drainage of massive glacial lakes in North America. This climate disruption caused significant changes in ocean circulation patterns and marine ecosystems across the North Atlantic. Maritime specialized populations would have been forced to follow changing resource patterns, explained Arthur Lawson. In some cases, this might have led to extraordinary journeys as they tracked migrating seal populations or fish stocks. The research team proposed a model of opportunistic contact, not an organized exploration mission, but small groups of maritime hunter-gatherers from both continents occasionally encountering each other while following marine resources in the North Atlantic. This contact would have been sporadic and limited, explaining why the genetic exchange was minimal but detectable. We're not talking about Vikings or intentional voyages of discovery, Langley emphasized. These were people intimately connected to marine ecosystems, with watercraft technology specialized for coastal movement. Under certain circumstances, perhaps being caught in storms or following unusual resource migrations during climate disruption, small groups might have crossed greater distances than they normally would. The genetic evidence suggested that these contacts were bidirectional, with DNA flowing both ways across the Atlantic. However, the overall genetic impact was limited, accounting for only a tiny percentage of either population's genome. This explained why it hadn't been detected in previous broad genetic surveys, which typically focus on major migration patterns rather than limited contact events. For the Black Irish mystery, this discovery added another layer of uniqueness to their genetic heritage. The Doggerland population that contributed to Western Ireland's gene pool had experienced a history unlike any other European group, including these rare North Atlantic contacts before settling permanently along Ireland's western shores. But the truly revolutionary aspect of this finding concerned not genetics but culture. As researchers examined archaeological sites from Mesolithic coastal communities across the North Atlantic, from Norway to Ireland to Newfoundland, they began noticing striking similarities in material culture, particularly in fishing technology, boat-building techniques, and symbolic artifacts. There are specific types of bone harpoons found at sites in Western Ireland that bear remarkable similarities to tools found in Nova Scotia from the same period, said Elena Marquez. Previously, these were explained as cases of convergent evolution, similar environments producing similar technologies. Now we have to consider the possibility of shared knowledge. Most intriguing were the symbolic similarities. Specific patterns of carved lines and dots appeared on ceremonial objects from both sides of the Atlantic, with such precise correspondence that coincidence seemed unlikely. These included distinctive wave pattern motifs found on artifacts from coastal sites in Ireland, Scotland, and Atlantic Canada. These symbolic systems likely represented shared cosmological understanding, ways of making sense of the maritime world these people inhabited, explained Dr. Brandon Mitchell, an archaeologist specializing in prehistoric symbolic communication. The ocean wasn't just a resource. It was central to their worldview and spiritual understanding. The research team began referring to this shared maritime culture as the North Atlantic Mesolithic Complex, a distributed network of coastal adapted populations spanning from Norway to potentially North America, connected not by political organization but by shared ecological adaptation, technological knowledge, and cultural elements. As this new understanding developed, the original Black Irish mystery took on much greater significance. What had begun as an investigation into a local Irish phenomenon had expanded into a rewriting of North Atlantic prehistory, revealing connections that crossed what were previously thought to be impermeable boundaries between continents. But perhaps the most profound implication concerned our understanding of human adaptability and specialized knowledge. These maritime peoples hadn't simply been pushed to coastal margins by more advanced agricultural societies. They represented a sophisticated and highly specialized adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments, the North Atlantic Ocean. Their knowledge of marine ecosystems, navigation, boat building, and weather prediction must have been extraordinary, said Langley. They weren't just surviving in these coastal environments. They were thriving through deep, specialized understanding of maritime resources. This revelation would prompt an entirely new approach to studying Ireland's western coastal communities, one that recognized them not as isolated peripheries, but as inheritors of an ancient maritime tradition that once spanned thousands of miles of ocean. The western coast of Ireland, with its wild Atlantic breakers crashing against ancient cliffs, had always attracted artists, writers, and seekers drawn to its primal beauty. But now, as the Doggerland research advanced, geneticists, archaeologists, and cultural anthropologists converged on these remote communities with a new perspective, searching for cultural continuities that might have survived alongside the distinctive genetic signature. Genetic heritage is just one form of inheritance, Hannah Jones explained as she walked along the windswept shore near Dingle, County Kerry. Knowledge, practices, beliefs. These can be preserved across thousands of years, sometimes in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The research team launched the Western Irish Cultural Heritage Project in 2019, combining genetic sampling with detailed ethnographic work. They interviewed elderly community members about traditional fishing practices, boat building techniques, weather prediction methods, and folk beliefs related to the sea. What emerged was astonishing. A distinctive maritime cultural complex that differed significantly from inland Irish traditions. These coastal communities maintained unique boat designs, notably the curragh, a lightweight vessel made of wood or woven fabric stretched over a wooden frame and waterproofed with tar. Although historically documented for centuries, new analysis suggested that curraghs shared fundamental design principles with reconstructed Mesolithic vessels from across the North Atlantic. The curragh's design maximizes flexibility in rough waters while minimizing weight for beach launching, explained marine archaeologist Dr. Patrick Donovan. These same principles appear in Mesolithic boat remains from Doggerland and coastal Norway. It's not identical technology, materials and specific techniques have evolved, but the core engineering approach has remarkable continuity. Even more striking were linguistic patterns preserved in the Irish language as spoken in western coastal regions. Dr. Siobhan O'Malley, a specialist in ancient Celtic languages, identified a subset of maritime terminology in Western Irish dialects that appeared to predate Celtic linguistic arrival in Ireland. Certain terms for ocean conditions, fish species, and navigational concepts in Western Irish dialects don't have clear Celtic etymologies, O'Malley noted. They represent a substrate language, vocabulary absorbed from pre-existing populations when Celtic speakers arrived in Ireland. This linguistic evidence aligned perfectly with the genetic model. Celtic-speaking peoples arriving in Ireland encountered established maritime communities along the western coast, descendants of Doggerland refugees, and incorporated elements of their specialized maritime vocabulary while gradually intermarrying with them. The most controversial aspect of the research involved traditional ecological knowledge, systems of understanding about marine environments passed down through generations. Dr. Langley collaborated with marine biologists to compare traditional fishing knowledge from Western Irish communities with scientific data on fish migration patterns, ocean currents, and weather systems. In several cases, local fishermen possessed knowledge about subtle ocean patterns that our instruments had only recently been able to detect, said Dr. Maria Fernandez, a marine biologist with the Irish Oceanographic Institute. For example, fishermen in the Aran Islands described specific deep-water upwelling zones that only became visible in satellite imagery within the last decade. This suggested an extraordinary continuity of observational knowledge, generations of fishermen passing down precise information about marine ecosystems through practical instruction and oral tradition. While the specific explanatory frameworks had changed over millennia, from animistic beliefs to Christian interpretations to modern scientific understanding, the core observational data had remained remarkably consistent. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful connections emerged through traditional music and storytelling. The sean-nós singing tradition of Western Ireland, an unaccompanied vocal style featuring complex ornamentation and modal melodies, had long been recognized as distinctive. New comparative analysis with recordings of traditional music from coastal Norway and even preserved indigenous music from Atlantic Canada revealed surprising structural similarities. These aren't the same songs, clarified ethnomusicologist Dr. James O'Brien, but they share specific technical elements, particular modal structures, ornamental techniques, and rhythmic patterns associated with ocean sounds. These musical features aren't found in inland musical traditions from the same regions. For many community members participating in the research, these connections created profound emotional responses. Michael O'Sullivan, an 87-year-old fisherman from Dingle whose DNA showed a high percentage of the Doggerland genetic markers, wept openly when researchers played recordings of Norwegian coastal singing that echoed elements of his own musical tradition. "It's like hearing the voices of my ancestors," he said. "Something in my blood recognizes this music, even though my mind has never heard it before." These cultural continuities raised profound questions about human memory and knowledge transmission. How could specialized ecological knowledge, technological approaches, and cultural expressions persist through thousands of years of language change, religious conversion, colonization, and modernization? The answer appeared to lie in the fundamental pragmatism of maritime adaptation. Knowledge that directly contributed to survival at sea, understanding weather patterns, navigation techniques, boat design principles, had concrete value that transcended cultural shifts. This practical knowledge was preserved because it worked, maintaining its utility across millennia. We're not suggesting some mystical racial memory, Hannah-Jones was careful to clarify. What we're seeing is the extraordinary resilience of knowledge systems that are constantly tested against reality. If you're fishing dangerous Atlantic waters, you preserve the techniques that keep you alive, regardless of what language you speak or gods you worship. This perspective transformed understanding of Western Irish coastal communities, not as isolated remnants of a homogeneous Celtic past, but as inheritors of one of Europe's oldest continuous cultural traditions, the maritime adaptation that had once spanned the North Atlantic. For the Black Irish themselves, this research offered a new narrative of origin far more profound than Spanish shipwrecks or Norman invasions. They were the living descendants of Europe's lost maritime civilization, the people who had mastered the North Atlantic's challenging environment thousands of years before Celtic language or culture reached Ireland's shores. But the full implications of this discovery extended far beyond Irish identity questions. It challenged fundamental assumptions about prehistoric human capabilities, cultural transmission, and the very nature of what we consider civilization. In Trinity College's long room, beneath the vaulted wooden ceiling and surrounded by ancient manuscripts, Dr. Alastair Langley addressed a gathering of international scientists, government officials, and media representatives. 5 years had passed since the initial discovery of the Doggerland genetic signature in Western Ireland, and the research had expanded far beyond its original scope. What began as an investigation into the origins of the Black Irish has developed into something far more significant, Langley said. We're now reevaluating fundamental assumptions about prehistoric maritime capabilities and challenging the continental bias that has dominated archaeological thinking for centuries. The continental bias Langley referenced was the long-standing tendency to view prehistoric cultural development primarily through the lens of land-based societies. Agricultural communities left more visible archaeological traces, permanent settlements, field systems, monumental architecture, while maritime cultures, with more ephemeral settlements and organic technologies, remained literally and figuratively marginalized. We've privileged the story of farming over the story of fishing, explained Hannah-Jones. Agricultural societies spread across Europe beginning around 7000 BCE, bringing new technologies, languages, and genetic lineages. But along the coasts, a different story was unfolding, one of remarkable continuity and specialized adaptation. This new perspective prompted reanalysis of coastal archaeological sites across Europe, revealing evidence of sophisticated maritime technologies dating back to the Mesolithic period, approximately 10,000 to 6,000 BCE. These included specialized fishing equipment, remnants of boats capable of open-water navigation, and evidence of deep-water fish species requiring offshore fishing capabilities. Most significant was the emerging picture of complex trade networks operating along maritime routes thousands of years before historians had previously acknowledged their existence. Distinctive raw materials, specific types of flint, amber, and shells, appeared at coastal sites thousands of miles from their sources, indicating regular long-distance movement along coastlines. These weren't primitive people huddled on the margins, Jones emphasized. They were specialists exploiting one of the richest environments on Earth, the productive coastal zones where land meets sea. The research revealed what appeared to be a distinct cultural sphere extending along the Atlantic facade of Europe, from Portugal to Norway, with particular concentration in the regions surrounding the North Sea and Irish Sea. This Atlantic Mesolithic complex shared technological approaches, artistic motifs, and ecological adaptations distinct from continental European traditions. Most revolutionary was the growing evidence for regular maritime movement across significant stretches of open water. Traditional archaeology had been reluctant to acknowledge prehistoric seafaring capabilities, assuming that open water crossings were rare and accidental before the development of complex sailing vessels in later periods. "We've underestimated these maritime peoples," said marine archaeologist Patrick Donovan. The crossing from Scotland to Ireland, about 12 miles at the closest point, was clearly regularly navigated by 800 BCE. The evidence suggests intentional, repeated journeys, not accidental drift. Even more dramatic was the evidence for regular navigation between mainland Europe and offshore islands like the Hebrides, Orkneys, and Shetlands, crossings of 25 to 100 miles that would have required sophisticated navigational knowledge and reliable watercraft. These were the astronauts of their age, Donovan continued. Crossing open water without modern instruments required extraordinary observational skills, understanding star positions, bird migration patterns, ocean currents, cloud formations, and subtle changes in watercolor that might indicate land beyond the horizon. This maritime perspective fundamentally altered understanding of how innovations spread in prehistoric Europe. Rather than technologies and ideas diffusing slowly overland, the traditional archaeological model, the evidence increasingly suggested that coastal networks facilitated rapid movement of knowledge along maritime routes. The sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway, Jones said. A boat could cover 50 miles in a day under good conditions, while land travel through forests and mountains might manage 10 miles. Maritime networks connected coastal communities across vast distances, creating a shared cultural sphere that operated parallel to, but distinct from, inland developments. This reframing elevated the significance of the Black Irish genetic heritage. Rather than representing an isolated historical curiosity, the Doggerland genetic signature in Western Ireland offered a window into a vast maritime cultural complex that had shaped European coastal development for thousands of years. The implications extended to our understanding of later historical periods as well. The mysterious spread of megalithic monuments along Atlantic Europe beginning around 5000 BCE, enormous stone structures requiring sophisticated engineering knowledge, had long puzzled archaeologists. The maritime network model offered a compelling explanation. These innovations spread primarily through coastal contacts rather than overland diffusion. When we map the earliest megalithic sites, they cluster along coasts and islands, explained archaeological cartographer Dr. Julian Martinez. Brittany, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Orkney. These are all regions with strong maritime traditions. The megalithic phenomenon appears to have spread via sea routes, not overland. This perspective even shed new light on the development of later Bronze Age trade networks. The emergence of complex metallurgical technologies in Atlantic Europe showed patterns of distribution that followed coastal routes, suggesting continuity of the maritime networks established thousands of years earlier. For Ireland specifically, this maritime perspective transformed understanding of its prehistoric development. Rather than viewing Ireland as a peripheral island that passively received cultural innovations from continental Europe, the new model positioned Ireland's western coast as an integral node in the Atlantic maritime network, a crossroads of knowledge exchange that had been active since the Mesolithic period. Ireland wasn't isolated. It was connected, just through different channels than we previously recognized, said Langley. The western coast didn't face away from civilization. It faced toward a maritime world that operated by different rules and valued different skills than agricultural societies. This reevaluation of prehistoric maritime capabilities raised the most controversial aspect of the research: the evidence for occasional pre-Columbian contact between Europe and North America. After years of rigorous analysis, the research team formally presented their findings on the genetic and archaeological connections between Mesolithic maritime communities on both sides of the North Atlantic. "We are not claiming regular contact or significant population movement," Hannah-Jones emphasized. "The evidence suggests occasional, opportunistic interactions, perhaps a few boats carried by storms or following unusual resource migrations during climate disruption events. But even these limited contacts were sufficient to leave detectable genetic and cultural signatures. The North American genetic evidence remains subtle but consistent. Specific genetic markers associated with the Doggerland population appeared in ancient samples from coastal sites in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Maine dating to approximately 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. These markers were absent in earlier samples from the same regions and represented only a tiny percentage of the genetic composition, consistent with very limited contact rather than significant migration. More compelling was the archaeological evidence. Specific tool types, manufacturing techniques, and symbolic motifs appeared simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic during this period. Particularly striking were distinctive harpoon designs and decorative patterns that showed such precise correspondence that independent invention seemed highly unlikely. "We need to reconsider what prehistoric peoples were capable of," Langley concluded. "Not by imagining fantastical lost civilizations or advanced technologies, but by recognizing the extraordinary depth of environmental knowledge, observational skill, and practical innovation that maritime adaptation required. These were people intimately connected to one of Earth's most challenging environments, with generations of accumulated knowledge about how to survive and navigate within it." For the descendants of these maritime pioneers, including the modern Black Irish communities along Ireland's western coast, this research offered a profound reframing of their heritage. They were not defined by later arrivals of Celts, Vikings, Normans, or apocryphal Spanish sailors, but by one of Europe's oldest continuous cultural traditions: the mastery of the Atlantic Ocean. Skellig Michael rises from the Atlantic like a vision from another world, a jagged pyramid of rock 7 miles off Ireland's Kerry coast. For centuries, visitors have marveled at the 6th-century monastery perched on its summit, accessible only by a steep climb up 600 hand-carved stone steps. But on this clear spring morning, Hannah-Jones wasn't focused on the medieval structures. Instead, she examined the island's lower reaches, where recent archaeological work had uncovered something far older. "This was a sacred place long before Christian monks arrived," she explained, pointing to newly excavated stone alignments dating to approximately 6,000 BCE, the Mesolithic period. These maritime people recognized something powerful about this island. The monks who came thousands of years later were continuing a tradition of spiritual connection that was already ancient. After 7 years of intensive research, the Western Irish Heritage Project had entered its final phase, examining how the maritime cultural legacy of the Doggerland refugees had shaped Ireland's subsequent development, including its distinctive spiritual traditions. "We've documented genetic continuity and technological adaptation," Alastair Langley explained. "Now we're exploring the most elusive aspect of cultural transmission: belief systems and worldviews that might have persisted alongside these more tangible elements." The research had uncovered a pattern of continued sacred significance attached to coastal promontories, offshore islands, and ocean-facing caves, locations that showed evidence of ritual activity dating back to the Mesolithic period and continuing, with evolving interpretations, through subsequent cultural phases. When St. Brendan the Navigator described sailing west to find paradise in the 6th century, said medieval historian Dr. Claire O'Neill, he was expressing a Christianized version of much older beliefs about sacred islands in the Western Ocean. These ideas appear in Irish mythology but have roots in the maritime cosmology of Mesolithic coastal peoples. The team had documented striking continuities in how Western Irish coastal communities conceptualized their relationship with the ocean. From Mesolithic ritual sites to Bronze Age offerings to early Christian holy wells near the shoreline, there was evidence of consistent sacred attention to the boundary between land and sea, particularly at locations where freshwater meets saltwater. These liminal spaces between elements were powerful in the maritime worldview, explained anthropologist Dr. Thomas Mitchell. Places where worlds meet, land and sea, fresh water and salt, above and below, were understood as points of connection to other realms of existence. This perspective illuminated distinctive elements of Western Irish Christianity that had puzzled historians, particularly its emphasis on sacred islands, holy wells, and cosmological stories featuring ocean voyages. Rather than viewing these as uniquely Celtic Christian innovations, the research suggested they represented Christianized continuations of the maritime spiritual tradition that had existed along the Atlantic coast for thousands of years. Most poignant was the evidence for continued ritual attention to ancestors. Mesolithic coastal sites showed clear patterns of ancestral commemoration, with human remains carefully placed in relation to the sea. This tradition continued with evolving forms through subsequent periods, from Bronze Age coastal burial monuments to early Christian inscribed stones facing the ocean. The people of the western coast maintained a relationship with their ancestors through the medium of the sea, Mitchell noted. This fundamental orientation, facing the ocean as a realm of both physical sustenance and spiritual power, has remained consistent for nearly 10,000 years. For the modern Black Irish communities participating in the research, these connections to ancient maritime tradition offered a profound sense of continuity and belonging. Michael O'Sullivan, the elderly Dingle fisherman, expressed this feeling while standing at a newly identified Mesolithic ritual site near his harbor. "My family has fished these waters for as many generations as anyone can remember," he said. "Now I understand we've been doing it for thousands of years. Reading the same waters, watching the same horizons, facing the same dangers. It's a strange feeling to suddenly see your life as part of something so ancient." This sense of connection extended beyond Ireland's shores. As genetic testing became more accessible, individuals with the distinctive Doggerland genetic markers were identified in coastal communities across the North Atlantic region, from western Norway to Scotland to Newfoundland. Many of these individuals reached out to the research team, sharing family histories that often featured maritime traditions maintained across generations. "We've received over 2,000 emails from people who carry these genetic markers," Langley said. "The most common response is a profound sense of recognition. People who've always felt drawn to the sea suddenly understanding that this connection is literally in their DNA." The research culminated in a landmark exhibition at Trinity College titled Children of the Sea, the Maritime Heritage of Atlantic Europe, featuring artifacts, genetic information, and cultural materials from coastal communities spanning 10,000 years of history. The exhibition emphasized continuity alongside change, showing how fundamental maritime adaptations persisted while expressing themselves through evolving cultural frameworks. "What we're witnessing isn't genetic determinism," Hannah Jones emphasized during the exhibition's opening. "Carrying Doggerland DNA doesn't magically make someone a good sailor or fisherman. What we're seeing is cultural transmission, specialized knowledge and perspectives maintained through practical teaching and community memory because they remained valuable for survival." This nuanced understanding offered an alternative to simplistic narratives about genetic heritage. Rather than claiming that genes dictate destiny, the research demonstrated how genetic continuity often accompanies cultural continuity, not because biology determines behavior, but because human communities tend to maintain both biological relatedness and knowledge transmission across generations. For Ireland, this research transformed understanding of its western coastal communities, not as peripheral outposts of Celtic culture, but as inheritors of Europe's oldest maritime tradition. The distinctive features that had earned them the label Black Irish, both genetic and cultural, weren't anomalies to be explained away through tales of shipwrecked Spaniards, but testament to the extraordinary resilience of a maritime adaptation that had endured for 10 millennia. "The true story of the Black Irish isn't about invasion or disaster," Langley concluded. "It's about continuity, about specialized knowledge and cultural memory maintained across thousands of years. It's about communities that never forgot their relationship with the sea. Even as languages changed, religions transformed, and empires rose and fell around them. As the sun set over Skellig Michael, Hannah Jones stood at the island's western edge, facing the vast Atlantic horizon. The conventional history of Ireland begins with Celtic arrival around 500 BCE, she said. But here on the western coast, we've documented a continuous human story stretching back nearly 10,000 years. A maritime civilization that was reading these waters and navigating these horizons long before Celtic language was spoken or written history began. She paused, watching a small fishing boat navigating the channel below. Its design not so different from the vessels that would have plied these waters thousands of years ago. That's the real secret of the Black Irish, she said. Not that they're descendants of shipwrecked Spaniards or mysterious Mediterranean peoples, but that they're the inheritors of Europe's oldest continuous cultural tradition. A tradition so practical, so effective, and so closely tied to survival that it has endured through invasions, conversions, and revolutions that erased almost everything else from that ancient world. As our research vessel pitched in the heavy Atlantic swell off Ireland's Blasket Islands, Dr. Alastair Langley steadied himself against the rail and pointed toward a distant headland barely visible through the mist. 10,000 years ago, a small group of people stood on a similar boat near that same headland, he said. They were refugees from a drowning world, Doggerland, carrying with them specialized knowledge about ocean currents, weather patterns, and marine resources that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. These maritime pioneers weren't desperate survivors, but specialists following familiar resources along newly formed coastlines, reading the ocean with a depth of understanding we're only beginning to comprehend today. When they established communities along Ireland's western shores, they weren't merely finding refuge, but continuing a way of life intimately connected to the rhythms and resources of the North Atlantic. Their descendants still fish these waters, Langley continued, nodding toward a small currach battling the waves nearby, its design essentially unchanged for thousands of years. Their genetic signature is still visible in the Black Irish populations of the western coast, and their cultural legacy, their profound understanding of the maritime world, continues to shape how these communities relate to the ocean that sustains them. The discovery of the Doggerland genetic heritage in Western Ireland has transformed our understanding not just of Irish history, but of European prehistory more broadly. It has challenged the continental bias that privileged the story of agricultural expansion over maritime adaptation, revealing a complex Atlantic world connected by sea routes and shared maritime knowledge thousands of years earlier than previously recognized. This maritime perspective illuminates historical developments previously considered mysterious or anomalous, from the rapid spread of megalithic monuments along Atlantic Europe to the distinctive spiritual traditions of Ireland's western coast. It reveals patterns of knowledge transmission and cultural continuity that operated alongside, but distinct from, the more visible transformations of language, religion, and political organization. For the modern descendants of these maritime pioneers, the people whose distinctive appearance earned them the label Black Irish, this research offers a profound reframing of identity. Rather than defining themselves through later arrivals or mythical origin stories, they can recognize their heritage as one of Europe's oldest continuous cultural traditions, the mastery of the Atlantic Ocean. This isn't just about genetics or ancient history, Hannah Jones emphasized during our final interview. It's about recognizing different forms of human achievement and different modes of knowledge transmission. The maritime peoples of Atlantic Europe developed systems of understanding that allowed them to navigate one of Earth's most challenging environments without modern instruments or written records. That knowledge was preserved across thousands of years because it worked, because it kept people alive in a demanding and sometimes hostile environment. As our vessel turned toward harbor, Langley gestured toward the darkening horizon. We've spent centuries celebrating the achievements of agricultural civilizations, their monuments, texts, and empires. But here along the Atlantic coast, a different kind of civilization flourished, one defined not by permanent structures or written records, but by extraordinary environmental knowledge, practical innovation, and cultural resilience. This perspective challenges us to reconsider what we value as human achievement and how we understand cultural transmission. The maritime communities of Atlantic Europe didn't build pyramids or develop writing systems, but they mastered navigation techniques that allowed them to cross dangerous waters, developed boat-building technologies that remained effective for thousands of years, and maintained systems of ecological knowledge that permitted sustainable harvesting of marine resources across millennia. Their legacy isn't written in stone or parchment, Jones said, but in the continuing relationship between coastal communities and the ocean that sustains them. It's written in fishing practices passed from parent to child across hundreds of generations, in boat designs refined through thousands of years of practical testing, and in cultural memories preserved in place names, folk traditions, and community identities. For Ireland, this maritime perspective transforms understanding of its place in European prehistory, not as a peripheral island that passively received cultural innovations from continental Europe, but as an integral node in the Atlantic maritime network that connected coastal communities from Portugal to Norway to potentially North America. The Black Irish themselves emerge not as anomalies requiring explanation through invasion narratives, but as living testimony to the extraordinary resilience of cultural and genetic continuity in human communities. Their distinctive appearance and maritime cultural traditions represent the visible legacy of Europe's oldest continuous cultural adaptation, one that has endured through language shifts, religious conversions, political upheavals, and technological revolutions that transformed almost everything else around them. In the final analysis, the story of the Black Irish offers a profound lesson about human adaptability and cultural memory. It demonstrates how specialized knowledge can persist across thousands of years when it remains relevant to survival and community identity. It reveals how cultural continuity often flows along practical channels, preserved not through abstract tradition, but through concrete skills that maintain their value across generations. As we approach the small harbor where our research journey had begun years earlier, Langley offered a final reflection on what this maritime perspective means for our understanding of humanity's past and future. For too long, we've told human history as a story of technological progression, agricultural expansion, and increasingly complex social hierarchies, he said. But here along the Atlantic coast, we see a different kind of human achievement, a deep, specialized relationship with a specific environment, maintained with extraordinary resilience across thousands of years of change. In an age of rapid environmental transformation and cultural disruption, this maritime legacy offers a powerful example of sustainable adaptation and knowledge preservation. The descendants of Doggerland didn't resist change. They incorporated new technologies, languages, and beliefs while maintaining the core knowledge that kept their communities alive in a challenging maritime environment. That might be their most important lesson for us today, Hannah Jones concluded as we stepped ashore. Not genetic essentialism or cultural purity, but the remarkable human capacity to preserve what works while adapting to new circumstances, to maintain relationship with specific places and environments across thousands of years of transformation. In the faces of Ireland's western coastal communities, those whose distinctive appearance once earned them the label Black Irish, we can see the living legacy of Europe's lost maritime civilization. Their story reminds us that human history isn't just written in monuments and texts, but in the continuing relationship between communities and the environments that sustain them, a relationship preserved not in archives or museums, but in the practical knowledge, cultural memories, and genetic heritage passed from generation to generation across the vast ocean of time.